I've been a critic of conventional economics for 40 years, and in the process of going through that I've worked out my own approach as well. But the major question you have to ask yourself is, why does such a gigantic crisis as we have now not be seen by the majority of professionals who are supposed to know about it? It's crazy that the experts were the ones who in general didn't see this crisis coming. I'm sure if you did a sample of the percentage of economists that knew there was a crisis coming versus the percentage of people who weren't economists who thought there might be one, there'd be more in the latter group than the former, and the former were wrong and the latter were right. Why on earth did that happen? I'm going to show you some quotes from conventional economists now, and it'll be pretty obvious after a few of those as to why they didn't see it coming. This is the guy who got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2004, Robert Lucas. And he said that macroeconomics was born in the 1940s. Well, in fact, it was born in the 1930s, but let's give him, he's only wrong by 10 years. That's pretty good for Lucas. And he said, it referred to the body of knowledge we thought would prevent another disaster. And he then said, we've succeeded in doing this. The central problem of preventing depressions has been solved for all practical purposes for many decades. And he wrote that in 2003. That was his inaugural speech as president of the American Economic Association. That's why it's on page 1 of the journal. Okay? That's the status of the man in his own profession. This is another person whose name you might know. I'll take a poll. Who do you think I'm talking? Who do you think is saying this here? Adam Smith's invisible hand with work at a grand scale. Greenspan. Okay? The apparent stability of the system shows the time-tested principle from Adam Smith, as Aaron mentioned a moment ago. Pursuing a self-interest leads to a growing, stable economy. Okay? Stable. That's what they thought it was. And when the crisis came, they said, well, it couldn't possibly have been anticipated because the system is stable, so the big downturns like this must be due to exogenous shocks. And here's a paper from a leading academic based in at Boston. I think he's probably at MIT or at Harvard. Adverse shocks can and do happen. Oh, pardon me, this is Olivier Blanchard. Wrong person I'm doing character assassination on here. This guy was founding editor of the American Economic Review of Macroeconomics in 2007. He was previously at the IMF. He's now back with the IMF as chief economist of the IMF. Getting an idea for this, the ranking of people who are deluded about the economy within economics. Okay? I'm a rebel. I'm on the outside. I'm a professor, but these guys ignored and derided the sort of work that I did and a whole group of colleagues, largely known as post-Keynesian economists, for the last 40 years. Now, here he's saying the shock came from the financial sector. Well, wouldn't most people think the financial sector is part of the economy? Okay? Okay? And these are the guys, first of all, I thought I was assassinating. It's a guy called Peter Ireland, I think his name is, from Harvard. It began with a series of adverse preference and technology shocks. And they're just about the same as the previous recession, nothing to really worry about. But then, unfortunately, they continued and got bigger. And that's what caused the crisis to be so big. And then they got less big, which caused part of the recovery. But then they've got big again. Exogenous shocks. And this one has just been brought to my attention by a colleague of mine in Australia, Wilson Sy, that did a lot of very good work on where financial instability comes from the behaviour of regulators as well. And he found this one saying that, this is Lucas again, 2011, okay, saying it was an unpredictable bank run due to irrational behaviour, herd behaviour. And here he's saying if enough people think sunspots will cause a bank run, then it'll happen. So who are we to say that sunspots are unrelated to the safety of banks? It's irrational behaviour by other people, not by economists. Yeah, they're the ones who are irrational, I'm afraid. So I found some paradoxical truths in all the work I'm doing to write the second edition of Debunking Economics. And the most important one, and I include myself in this, economists are not experts on the economy. Okay? They're experts on a model of the economy. And the question then is the model accurate or not? Now, if you're an expert on a car, that happens to be your own car, you know every last thing about it. Okay? You're an expert on that particular instance. But give economists a bit of credit here. The economy is rather more complex than a car, a much more complex system. You can't hold an economy like you can hold a carburettor. Can't hold part of it. So therefore, you have to have a model to guide what your thinking is about how the economy functions. And if you build up an elaborate model over time, that's what you perceive when you look at the economy. You don't perceive the actual economy. You can't perceive the economy itself. But being experts on the model of the economy, you can be wrong about it. And there's another one great weakness as well, which when I realised it, it's another transcendental truth. This dominant model is called Neoclassical Economics. In the last book, I didn't reference it particularly frequently. I just called it economics in general. This time round, I'm being deliberate. I'm saying neoclassical all the way through, because you have to know who the real cause of the problem was in this crisis. And neoclassical economists don't understand their own model. They've been taught it in textbooks, and the textbooks you can normally rely upon in any discipline, a textbook to give you a condensed, easy to swallow version of the research on which the discipline is based. That is not true in economics. The textbooks distort the research if the textbook writers themselves know that research, which frequently I'd have to say they don't. They learn in our textbooks, they produce a watered-down version of the same textbook. That particularly applies to Gregory Mankiw, who's a professor at Harvard, whose students staged a walkout on him recently. And congratulations to the students for doing that. Only 10%, but you've got to start somewhere. Walked out on him. Now, the model that neoclassicals use these days of the economy goes by the initials of DSGE, and that stands for something really fancy: dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium. Sounds cool, doesn't it? Anything that complicated, you must know what you're talking about. Well, there's two variants to that model as well. I'm going to describe them as peas in the pod straight away, because the people inside this vehemently fight with each other over how my model is better than your model. But it's like a round pea arguing with a crinkly pea as to which one tastes better. They're both peas. Okay? Now, the round ones are called freshwater, or they call themselves classical economists, which is an insult to the memory of not just Adam Smith, but David Ricardo and Karl Marx and many others, because they've never even read any of the people they call, who actually first were called classical economists. And they model an economy which is a perfect economy in a perfect equilibrium all the time. And those are the ones who said there couldn't be a crisis. Then there's a bunch who call themselves saltwater or Keynesian, and Paul Krugman's probably the most prominent of those in the popular media, but a guy called Michael Woodford's the most important in developing the theory. They have an imperfect economy in an imperfect equilibrium most of the time. Well, isn't that a huge difference? Okay. Now, the saltwater type ended up dominating the fight in the pea pod. The pod that won was the crinkly pea. That won the fight. And this is Blanchard now talking about the state of economics just before, actually no, not just before the crisis. I'm delighted to say this particular paper about how good macroeconomics is, which said the fact that the crinkly pea fitted the data better than the smooth pea. That paper, concluding that macro was good, was published on August 12 or 13, I think, of 2008. Then became a journal paper in 2009. The crisis is generally dated as starting from August 6 or 7, I think it was, of 2007, which was the day in which the Banque Nationale of Paris shut down 3 of its funds that had large exposures to the subprime market back in America. So 1 year and 6 days after the event, he says the state of macro was good. And you can't blame it on publication deadline. That was a working paper. He actually posted it himself on that day. Now, in saying it was in a good state, he noted one dissenter from it, a person called Robert Solow. Now, Robert Solow is another Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's neoclassical, but I'll give Solow credit before I go into other things I'm going to give him credit for as well. He did engage in some of the debates with the non-orthodox economists back in the 60s and 70s about the nature of economic theory. Had a very fractious relationship with a non-orthodox economist called Joan Robinson, and that scarred his views in many, many ways. But he was, at least would engage. He knew there were critics out there. Now, he designed what's called the neoclassical growth model. I think that's the reason he got the Nobel Prize. And talking about the models that the peas and the pod both fight over, they're both fundamentally what are called real business cycle models. And he said, it's nothing but my growth model. And he said, when I worked it out 40 years ago, there was one thing I knew it didn't apply to, and that's short-term fluctuations in output and employment, or what we call the business cycle. And he says, now if you pick up a paper calling itself about the business cycle, it'll be just a slightly dressed-up version of my growth model. And he says, how on earth did this happen? He was incredulous. No other way to describe his reaction. And this is now his description of that model. I wrote this description in Debunking Economics and then finished up by saying, you think I'm joking? Because I was obviously, as a critic, I'd be doing a parody. This is how Solow summarised the model. It has a single consumer optimising over an infinite time period with perfect foresight in an environment which plans are realised perfectly through flawless markets, blah, blah, blah. And give him credit for sensibility here, because most economists lack it. How could anyone expect a sensible short to medium run macroeconomics to come out of that setup? Now, this is a Nobel Prize winning economist criticising Nobel Prize winning economists. Okay? And he starts saying, start from the presumption with macro, you want to be able to explain the occasional pathologies like recessions and so on that beset the economy. A model that rules them out by definition is unlikely to help. Now, the saltwater mob might think they're better than that because they've got pathologies. They say imperfect competition, sticky wages, sticky prices and stuff like that. That explains it. If with all smooth prices, everything adjusted instantly, there'd be no problem. Krupin's actually said that recently again. But he puts the crinkles in because the system doesn't adjust smoothly, and that's why we have problems. Well, Solow's equally disparaging about them, because he said the type he was talking about, which is the freshwater lot, have no empirical success whatsoever. So along come the more free spirits, he's thinking about Krugman there in particular, and Woodford, allowing for imperfections in the labour market and capital market, which therefore mean things don't happen smoothly. He said the model then sounds better and fits the data better, which isn't surprising because they've added the imperfections to make it look that way. Okay, it's like putting currants in a cake. It's not actually changing the fact that it's still made of flour. And his attitude to the idea, because that was the way they fitted the data before the financial crisis. But the financial crisis was so big that they couldn't fit it even with the imperfections they added in. So they had to vary how hard they shook the cake maker, if you like. That variable shock stuff I showed you to begin with is the way they've responded to the crisis, by saying a bigger shock than we ever thought could happen, and then it kept on going longer, and even though it's random, it stayed negative all the time, whereas random numbers will bounce around. If you have random numbers between -1 and +1, a few of them are going to be positive, okay? But they've got all negative random numbers. Strange. He said, why should why should reasonable people accept this? So if you're feeling sceptical about conventional economic theory, you have every reason to be that way. Now, it's truly in a tragic state. So how did economics get that way? Well, it took a book to explain it. Okay? And that's most of what I do in the book. But it is easy to explain the crisis, which is why people like myself and Lagi and Nicole and so on saw it coming. We focus on private debt. And it was a private debt bubble caused the boom and caused the bust as well. And it's quite easy to show it empirically. When you take a look at the level of debt to GDP, going back to 1920 in America, the red line is private debt, the blue line is public. Now you can see there's a peak of private debt back in the 1930s, the Great Depression. We're at a bigger peak of private debt now compared to GDP than back then. And what are politicians obsessing about? They're obsessing about the blue line. Now you can see already it's 1/5 or 1/6 the level of private debt. If we've got a debt problem, empirically it's private debt, not public. But the politicians and neoclassical economists who are still advising them, okay, they still haven't broken away from believing neoclassical theory, they obsess about public debt. Now that's risen 30% since the crisis began in terms of percentage of GDP. That's pretty big. But the real cause of the downturn when they're suffering is a decline in private debt. That's fallen 48% from its peak, more than outweighing the increase in public debt. And that's actually what's caused the crisis. Now I know if you're going to have a about that, how on earth is falling debt a problem? If rising debt was a problem, how did falling debt be a problem? But shouldn't it be a solution? Well, there's actually two sources of spending that you have, and I want to explain the dynamics here. Obviously you can spend out of what you earn, but you can also swipe your credit card. Okay, so your total spending at any moment in time is going to be the sum of what you earn plus your change in debt. Now neoclassical economics counts the first one, but they ignore the second. That's why they didn't look at the level of debt. Their argument going, and this is quoting Paul Krugman from 2010 December, revised in February. Last time I wrote Debunking, I got accused for using out-of-date references. They shouldn't have told me that. Now I'm quoting them up to date. That's even worse. So they say the overall level of debt makes no difference. One person's assets, another person's liability. Boom, overall no effect. And they model banking as having a patient agent leading to an impatient agent. So what actually happens in that sort of vision is you have a patient person who's got lots of money and an impatient person who's got none. And what happens is the patient person lends the impatient person some money. The bank just shuffles the money between the two. In the aggregate, the patient person can spend less, impatient can spend more. There's no change in aggregate demand, therefore they ignore not just the role of debt, but they also ignore banks. So 99.9% of economic models don't have banks in them, which is a pretty good way of understanding capitalism, ain't it? Okay. Now, what is actually happening is, as you'll hear from most people who are critical of the system, creating money out of nothing. And this is not a new notion in academic economics. The good economists, it doesn't include any neoclassicals, Solo gets a bit of a Guernsey there, but it's people like Schumpeter and Marx before him. Marx was a critic of capitalism, but a much better thinker about it than most of the conventional mob. Keynes, though he was pretty woolly and fuzzy compared to Schumpeter, the best I think is Schumpeter. And Schumpeter wrote this back in the mid-1930s, before Keynes. He said the conventional answer about where you get spending power from is basically the saver transfers to borrower. But he said the real method of it is the creation of purchasing power by the banks. And he says there, it's not a question of transferring purchasing power that already exists, but creating new purchasing power out of nothing. This is one of the few economists who deserve a Nobel Prize. He was born before they made it up, or died before they made it up. So what actually happens is this. You've got an entrepreneur going to a bank, and the bank gives a loan to the entrepreneur and creates a deposit simultaneously. And this is put best back when, by actually of all people, a senior vice president for research for the Federal Reserve, fighting monetarism at the time, saying in the real world, not the economic theory, banks extend credit, creating deposits in the process, and they look for the reserves later, which is the reverse of the process that people are taught in textbooks. So what happens is they have an assets and liabilities, and simultaneously the bank grants you money and says you've got a ball and chain called debt at the same time. That's an endogenous expansion of spending power. The increase in debt enables spending to take place that doesn't require somebody else to spend less. Therefore, aggregate demand exceeds what you get just from income alone. And so neoclassicals are quite wrong to ignore the role of change in debt. They ignore debt, and they therefore ignore the change in debt. It's change in debt that explains what's going on. So if you start from saying aggregate demand is the sum of income plus the change in debt, you can then say, what are those particular sources of demand fund? Well, income mainly finances consumption. The change in debt mainly finances two things. A good thing, which is investment, new factories, innovation, and so on, but also gambling on asset prices. And I don't need to tell Americans about that after your housing bubble has burst. Okay? Those are the three ways you can spend money. And you spend, that's the three ways of spending money. So you spend, therefore you're financing new goods and services, which you can call the real economy, but also what happens with financial assets, which is called the FIRE economy, which stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. Now, I'm going to call that last bit net turnover of assets, because all goods and services that are bought are effectively consumed, but we don't turn over all assets every year. So you can break it down to the price of assets multiplied by the quantity of assets that are out there, the number of houses, number of shares, and so on, times the annual turnover, because only a small percentage are sold in any particular year. So net asset turnover is those three things all multiplied together. So the overall balance, looking in an accounting sense now and trying to say, how do I balance the books overall? Income plus the change in debt, which is the demand side of the equation, is going to be equal to output, GDP, plus net asset turnover. Now that means the change in debt has an impact on the level of sales of goods and services, but also the price of financial assets. So there's a relationship between the change in debt and the price of financial assets. Now, then you say, what about the change in demand? What happens there? Well, that's going to be change in income, and this is the tricky bit. plus the acceleration in debt. Okay? It's how fast the rate of change of debt is changing. Change in the rate of change. And that's going to be equal to change in GDP, which will have, inflation and change in employment and so on, plus the change in net asset sales, and most of that's going to turn up in the prices of shares and houses. So I can now show this empirically. And what it means is that aggregate demand can fall just when the change in debt slows down. It doesn't have to go negative, but of course it went massively negative. And it also explains that what actually causes price bubbles, like bubbles in share prices and house prices, is not just rising debt, but accelerating debt. So to get rising house prices, you have to have accelerating debt all the time. Now, of course, that can't happen, because just like if you're driving a car, it can't accelerate forever. Okay? Otherwise, you'll be doing the speed of light as you head down towards Chicago. And therefore, when you reach your maximum velocity in driving the car, your acceleration becomes zero. And if you slow down, you're still going forward, but if you slow down, your acceleration is negative. Now, apply this to the economy. Let's see, why did it boom from 1993 to 2007, and why did it crash in 2007 along with the asset markets? Well, the change in debt was enormous. Economists have been ignoring it, but thank God the statisticians have kept the numbers. And the increase in debt boosted demand by $4 trillion in your $14 trillion economy. Now, at the other end, after the crisis hit, and you went from reducing debt, it was cutting demand by $2.8 trillion off your $14 trillion economy. So you went from $18.3 trillion in total aggregate demand, including the money spent buying shares, net money spent buying shares and houses, to $11.5 trillion in 2 years. That's why it was so damn big. And this is graphing it. The blue line adds the change in debt to the red line, which is just GDP. And you can see the scale of the difference. You went from there to there in a 2-year period. That's from 18.3 to 11.5 trillion in turnover of the economy in a 2-year period. Now, the government did a bit of a rescue here, and I often don't include the government in my analysis because I'm building up my analysis from the private economy first of all and adding government in later, which I'm now starting to do. But I've always had this argument as well. I want to now put some empirical information into it. The government also creates money by running a deficit. Banks create money by creating loans. Governments create money by creating a deficit. And that's not credit money, of course, is what they call fiat money. And that creation of the deficit partially offset the negative impact of the decline in government spending. So the black line adds the government change in debt to the blue line as well. And you can now see that there was a big increase in the gap between the blue and the black line, a change in the scale of the government deficit. And that meant the downturn wasn't quite as severe. Rather than going from 18.7 trillion down to 11 and a bit, you went down to 13 trillion. So it partially offset how deep the crisis was. And you can see now that when you add the change in government debt on top of private debt, you're now finding that the debt contribution to demand is slightly larger than overall GDP as well. Didn't make to animate that one, unfortunately. But I want to show you the correlation now between the change in debt and what's happening with unemployment. And you can see the correlation there visually. It's about 0.95, negative 0.95. I've got unemployment upside down because that shows the correlation more visibly. But it shows the role of change in debt in driving unemployment. And if only economists would look at the empirical data before they make a conclusion. They can't say it doesn't matter when you get correlations like that over 20 years. It also shows in the stock market. Now, the stock market is an incredibly volatile creature and much more than just the change in overall money supply that makes it move around. It's not quite that mechanical. But when you take a look over a 20-year period, you're still saying the fine basic argument that I've shown you about acceleration applying. The acceleration in debt drives the overall behaviour of the stock market. That's about a 0.25 correlation. So accelerating debt drives share prices up. Decelerating debt drives them down. You can see how fast the deceleration was. It was peaked out at minus 26% of GDP. That's one hell of a... Any car enthusiast here can translate that into miles an hour of acceleration and deceleration in a vehicle. It's dramatic. It's about 1.5 times as fast as the deceleration during the Great Depression. This is more obvious when I show you the mortgage debt. That really is what gave you your last crisis. That was the final gasp of the American nightmare. That's the correlation of the acceleration in mortgage debt to the change in real house prices. And that's a 0.8 correlation, going back to 1990. Now, obviously neoclassical economists are wrong, massively wrong. And if we're going to ever be able to understand capitalism, we need to get rid of them. I'm open to all sorts of methods. Okay. Now, they ignore debt, they ignore disequilibrium, all sorts of things that matter in a capitalist economy. It's why they've led us up the garden path, or they've led us into the desert more the garden path. But there are mistakes made by critics and reformers as well. There's a fallacy that's quite widespread, and it applies inside conventional, non-orthodox economists as well to some extent, that you can't ever repay debt. Later on I'll show that's wrong. And also, of course, at the right-wing end of the spectrum, some people think the problem's entirely due to the government. That's where the Tea Parties come from. Equally, on the left end, some people say just government deficits can solve the whole problem. I think they're wrong too. So we need a realistic approach to economics before we can really answer any of those questions, and that's what I'm working on, and I'll be getting onto that, showing you some of that, I think, later in the conference. So thank you.
Okay, we are going to give Steve some feedback.